I have my criticisms of both the Palestinian Authority, of Fatah, of Hamas, and for that matter, pretty much of everyone else. But I think the one insurmountable obstacle to reaching a resolution of this crisis is the current Palestinian leader, Mahmoud Abbas. Him personally, more than the PA or Fatah or anyone else. And I think until he drops dead or is removed from the scene or retires or whatever, I think serious discussion of a resolution of this issue only becomes possible once he is no longer there to block it.
Salamat everyone. You are listening to Red Inverted Triangle. This show is about the ongoing struggle for liberation in Palestine, produced on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Like Palestine, Australia is the ground zero of a genocide that has been occurring for over 200 years and continues to this day. From the river to the sea, this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name is Ahmed. I am a Palestinian living on this stolen land, and I'll be your host. This podcast aims to provide the Palestinian story, the Palestinian narrative. It's necessary because we live in a heavily indoctrinated society where, as Palestinians, being able to speak, to tell our stories and narrate is the ultimate form of resistance. That's right, resistance, hence the name of our show, Red Inverted Triangle. Each week, we'll be bringing you different segments, such as news updates from Palestine, Palestinian music, interviews with Palestinian figures or non-Palestinian figures talking about Palestine, and everything else related to Palestine. Thanks for tuning in, and long live the resistance. This episode of Red Inverted Triangle, we are bringing you a conversation I've had with Mouin Rabbani. Mouin Rabbani is a researcher, analyst, and commentator specializing in Palestinian affairs, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the contemporary Middle East. He has, among other positions, served as Principal Political Affairs Officer with the Office of the United Nations Special Envoy for Syria, Senior Middle East Analyst and Special Advisor on Israel-Palestine with the International Crisis Group, and researcher with Al-Haq, West Bank affiliate of the International Commission of Jurists. Rabbani is co-editor of Jadaliyya, where he also hosts the Connections podcast, co-hosts the Long-Form Conversations podcast, and edits its Quick Thoughts feature. He is also contributing editor of Middle East Report. I hope you'll find my conversation with Mouin Rabbani useful and productive. Enjoy. Mouin, welcome to the conversation, and thank you so much for making the time for us today.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, for the introduction and for hosting me today.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you. You know, a lot has happened over the course of the past year and a half. Actually, a lot has happened over the past 2 months, ever since the ceasefire started in Gaza. The biggest event that's on everyone's mind at the moment is the recent Trump announcement to own Gaza, transfer its population to neighboring countries or elsewhere, and turn it into the Riviera in the Middle East. And even the more recent blatant threat that Trump made to the residents of Gaza. There's a lot of uncertainty around the future or what the future holds in Gaza, the practical reaction of the Arab leadership to all these announcements. The Palestinian residents of Gaza are now enduring a more brutal psychological and mental warfare in the face of this forced voluntary evacuation of Gaza, or in a more legal term, the war crime of ethnic cleansing of Gaza. We're going to talk in length about all these things, about this plan of transfer, as it were. But before all that, I just want to check in with you, Mouin. I mean, how are you feeling about all this? I personally, I'm feeling incredibly anxious, not only about Gaza, the place where I lived and grew up in, and about my family and, all the families in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and 1948 Palestinians. But I'm also anxious about us living in the diaspora, facing up to this intensifying and vicious campaign of silencing and intimidation on behalf of the Zionist proxies here and worldwide. So How are you holding up with all these things?
Well, thanks for asking, but I feel that it's somehow inappropriate to discuss personal circumstances when you have an entire people being subjected to genocide, facing it directly on an ongoing basis now, as you mentioned, for a year and a half. With now the prospect not only of very much worse to come, but also of its expansion, not only to the West Bank, as we've seen, but potentially to the Palestinian community in Israel as well. We've already, of course, seen it in Lebanon and now Syria. And we really could be on the cusp of a new and widespread regional conflict in the coming years.
What does Trump's proposed transfer plan historically and ideologically mean for the state of Israel? I mean, and also how practical is this plan? You know, some argue, that just the other day I heard some Israeli commentators saying, oh, well, I mean, millions of Syrians have left Syria during the past few years. So it can happen. Many countries can host the Palestinians from Gaza. So how practical is it, and what does it mean in the psyche of the Israelis?
Yes. Well, that's quite a few questions, so I'll unpack it, and I'll start by referring to a bit of history. But before doing so, I think it's important to start with an important caveat, which is that you're asking me a question about the current U.S. administration. And whenever discussing anything about Donald Trump, I think it's important to recognize that he's an extraordinarily erratic, impulsive, unpredictable, and often self-contradictory leader as well. And that makes it very difficult to speculate on anything with anything approaching certainty. I mean, we can have informed speculation and educated guesses, but ultimately anything and its opposite are equally likely within the next day or week or month or year. So having said that, let's go back a few months. And we had, I think, a very significant political development regarding the situation in Gaza and Palestine and the Middle East more generally. And that was Trump's electoral victory against Biden's Vice President Kamala Harris and the Biden administration's subsequent ouster from power in Washington. And so you had what is, by a very wide margin, the most pro-Israeli U.S. administration in history, being replaced by one that Trump, I think, at the end of the day, doesn't really care for either the Palestinians or Israel, or for that matter, anyone else. The only genuine commitment he has is to Donald Trump, which I think is a fundamental difference between him and his predecessor, who had a passionate attachment, a fanatic level of support for Israel. And this had real consequences because in May of last year, in May of 2024, Biden presented a ceasefire proposal that, according to Biden, had been formulated by Israel and personally by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which then in July was accepted by Hamas, but was never implemented because it was designed to be rejected by the Palestinians. And then when Hamas accepted it, Netanyahu started adding new conditions. And in rejecting Biden's proposal, Netanyahu had the total and unconditional support to do so from none other than Joe Biden. So you fast forward to December, January, and Trump comes into office. And I think he was primarily motivated by a personal consideration, which is that his inauguration was on January 20th of this year, and he did not want a foreign policy crisis on his plate the day he entered the White House, and particularly didn't want one that also included American captives in the Middle East, which brought back memories of the Iran hostage crisis when everyone was already talking about Jimmy Carter, who had just passed away. So he sent his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, to the region. And bear in mind, we're now talking about the weeks before Trump formally became president. Witkoff had one meeting with Netanyahu, and he told him, here's what's going to happen. And lo and behold, within 48 hours, Israel accepted the ceasefire proposal that it had been rejecting with Biden's support for over half a year. So this should make very clear to you how the U.S.-Israeli relationship works. The U.S. is a superpower, and Israel is the obedient proxy. Yes, of course, the Israel lobby is powerful. Of course, there are Israeli politicians that are bought and paid for. Of course, it has been very effective in silencing pro-Palestinian voices and all the rest of it. But ultimately, this is a relationship between a powerful state and its proxy that conforms to the template of such relationships. Now, there was a second issue, which is that at Israel's insistence, there was not, let's say, a single ceasefire agreement whereby the commitments of each parties are laid out and implemented simultaneously, but rather the agreement was divided into three phases. The first phase consisted of a suspension of hostilities, a limited exchange of captives between Israel and the Palestinians, a limited withdrawal of Israeli forces from areas within the Gaza Strip that it had occupied since October 2023, and a surge in humanitarian assistance. The second phase consisted of a durable ceasefire and the completion of the captive exchange and the completion of a full Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. But the second phase, although its objectives had been identified, the mechanisms to achieve it had not yet been specified. And so part of the first phase stated that on the 16th day of the first phase, which was to last for 42 days, Israel and the Palestinians would commence negotiations on the mechanisms for achieving the objectives of the second phase. Now, you talk to any informed Israeli analyst, virtually any Israeli politician, and even a number of Netanyahu's own negotiators, and there was unanimity among them. Netanyahu does not want the agreement to reach the second stage because the second stage includes a durable ceasefire, meaning his ambition that he's been constantly touting of total and complete victory would no longer be achievable. And everyone was predicting that Netanyahu would do everything within his power to try to sabotage the agreement and resume his genocidal military campaign before during the transition from the first to the second phase. And the Americans tried to accommodate Netanyahu while preserving the agreement, in their view, by basically proposing a completely different agreement, one that would extend the first phase at the expense of concluding the second phase. And Hamas rejected it. It said, we've already agreed to a text. That's the only text we're prepared to implement. And then it was in this context that you began to see these harebrained proposals. First, the Gaza Riviera proposal, which would include the forcible mass expulsion, permanent forcible mass expulsion of all Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. I think it was a dead on arrival, stillborn, dead in the water. It was never going to be implemented. That doesn't make it irrelevant because it basically put ethnic cleansing once again on the policy agenda. It sought to transform the question of Palestine from a political question that needs to be addressed and resolved through issues like self-determination, decolonization, and statehood to a purely humanitarian question, which is to be resolved through providing jobs, housing, and social services. That I think, is the real danger of this proposal rather than anything that may happen on the ground. But, Israel persisted in dragging its feet and not meeting its commitments under the first phase of the agreement. And then you had this crisis where, unless something happened, the agreement was going to be derailed and the genocide would resume in full force. And it was very clear, this is not a decision that's going to be made by Israel. Either the United States would authorize Netanyahu to derail the agreement, or it would give him his marching orders about maintaining the agreement. And in this context, we had two developments yesterday. On the one hand, we had this unprecedented reports of the U.S. engaging in direct negotiations with Hamas. And at the same time, later that same day, Trump on social media made these blood-curdling genocidal threats that if the Palestinians do not release all the remaining captives immediately and unconditionally and release all the corpses in their possession, that basically they would all be dead. My view is that what the United States is doing is more important than what it's saying, and that the reason Trump is making these outlandish statements is so that he can kind of camouflage what the US is doing on the ground, which in my view is exercising pressure on Israel to maintain the agreement. And then when further captives are released, rather than saying it's because we finally came to our senses and negotiated with Hamas, he can say, well, my threats clearly intimidated them. And that's why these people are now being released. So again, informed speculation and not more, because we're dealing with a very erratic and impulsive leadership in Washington. But my sense is that the U.S. recognizes that the only alternative to this agreement that's being offered by Israel is another forever war in the Middle East that will spread regionally, that its intention is to conclude in a direct confrontation between the United States and Iran, and on that basis is most likely trying to find a formula to maintain the agreement that is acceptable to both Israel and the Palestinians.
Is this why Netanyahu and Israel continue to push for the prolongation of the genocide? I mean, what is the reason that Israel is adamant to continue the genocide and the war against Gaza? Is it just to finish Hamas, as what they say?
Well, I suspect, after almost a year and a half, Israel has now understands that getting rid of Hamas or anything else for that matter is easier said than done. It's extremely unlikely that a weakened Israel can now succeed where it has already strategically failed in a year and a half, even if Hamas itself is also significantly weakened. I think we're dealing here with a variety of personal, political, and strategic and ideological considerations. If you read the press, people are always talking about Netanyahu desperately hanging on to power, and that if the war comes to a formal end, that his coalition will fall apart, that Netanyahu will lose power, that he'll probably end up in prison, not for his war crimes and crimes against humanity, but rather because of some corruption charges that he's facing from the Israeli judiciary. That's all true, but that's only part of the story. The other story, of course, is that Israel was dealt the most by Israel's own admission, certainly judging by these investigatory reports being conducted by Israeli intelligence and military that are now being published. Israel suffered the most significant defeat, if you will, in its history on October 7th, 2023, which from an Israeli perspective were more severe than even October 6th, 1973. And given Israel's military doctrine, it wants to reestablish its uncontested hegemony, not only over the Palestinians, but towards any other potential adversary. And therefore, it wants, to seek to achieve as much damage as it still can to kind of deter the Palestinians or anyone else watching from ever thinking of challenging Israel ever again. Then, of course, it also now sees a real opportunity to forcibly expel the population of the Gaza Strip, and under cover of its genocide in the Gaza Strip, to expand its insatiable lust for Palestinian land in the West Bank. So you take all of these factors together, and I think that provides a fairly coherent explanation of Israel's agenda. Israel's problem, of course, is that it is not the decision maker. Its decisions have to be authorized by the Americans on it, because we've learned once again very clearly during the past year and a half how utterly dependent Israel is militarily, politically, and diplomatically on its sponsors in Washington and in Europe to a lesser extent.
It was absolutely clear its dependence on all these powers and their support, in terms of the military equipment, in terms of political cover as well. So I just want to go back to this transfer deal. What's your analysis on the Arab leadership's response? I mean, why do you think they are reluctant to kind of accept? What is the real reason other than the perfunctory statements that they're usually provided?
So what's happened is that during the past year and a half, for that matter, for the most part, during the past century, Arab leaders have stood by as kind of inert spectators while Palestine was transformed from an Arab territory into a Jewish state, while it was the remainder of mandatory Palestine was unoccupied by Israel in 1967, while it was relentlessly colonized from 1967 onwards. And in the past year and a half, we have seen the Arab leadership and their collective institution, the Arab League, essentially stand by like an inert spectator while Israel is perpetrating genocide against the Palestinians in their own homeland. What Trump triggered, and I don't think he quite realized he was doing this, is his proposal, and I wouldn't call it a plan because, it doesn't have the elements of a plan. Trump's proposal basically sought to transform a Palestinian crisis into an Arab crisis. Trump was proposing to export the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, and I would argue by implication from the West Bank as well, to the Arab world. Now, that was seen by the Arab states, by the Arab governments, as a direct threat to their national security, because Arab perceptions of Palestine, particularly at the popular level, are in large part defined by the Nakba in the late 1940s, by the mass expulsion of Palestinians from their homeland and its transformation into a Jewish state. Arab solidarity with the Palestinians, opposition to further such ethnic cleansing, lies at the very core of Arab solidarity with the Palestinians. Now, these governments that you're asking me about, they may well be Washington's client regimes. They may well be very loyal to Washington, but not to the extent of being prepared to sign their own political death warrants out of loyalty to Washington, because they understand that if they are seen to cooperate with this scheme, whether officially or informally, they would essentially be committing political suicide. And there's also another element here, which just go back at the history. Look, for example, take the case of Jordan. Jordan, as has been documented in very extensive detail by the British-Israeli historian Avi Shlaim, Jordan during the 1930s and 1940s colluded with the Zionist movement in order to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state west of the river Jordan. And as a result of which, Jordan was able to annex what became the West Bank after 1948. This collusion cost the current monarch's great-grandfather, King Abdullah, his life because he was assassinated in 1951. More importantly, the expulsion of the Palestinians did not resolve Israel's dilemma, because the Palestinians simply then took up arms to seek to retrieve their rights from outside the borders of Palestine. And after 1967, Jordan became and the Jordan Valley in particular, became the most important base of the PLO, the Palestinian guerrilla movements that emerged during the 1950s and 1960s. And this led to not only direct conflict between Israel and Jordan, but also extensive Israeli bombing raids into Jordanian territory, and ultimately an armed conflict between the Jordanian state and the PLO in 1970, known as Black September, that cost thousands of lives. Now, which Arab government in their right mind wants to undergo a similar experience simply for the privilege of resolving Israel's Palestinian problem at Arab expense? I mean, you look at what happened in Lebanon, for example, that was related to the Palestine question as well. And none of them want to experience a potentially existential legitimacy problem, and certainly not a national security crisis, simply because Israel refuses to implement agreements it has already agreed to, and because Israel thinks that it has an exception from abiding by UN resolutions and international law and all the rest of it.
That's fascinating analysis back into the history of this reaction from the Arab governments towards the Palestinians. But I want to talk about the legal issues and the legal implications of such an announcement by Trump. How does this plan impact the global rule of law in the world? I mean, and how does Trump administration in general impact the global rule of law? I mean, we saw, the American sanctions on the International Criminal Court, ICC's Karim Khan. We've seen sanctions on South Africa because of their involvement in the ICJ, accusing Israel of genocide. How is going to be the rule of law moving forward with this belligerent Trump administration?
Well, before answering your question, I'd like to say that I think it's important not to look at Trump in isolation. We have to look at him in context, because people like to view Trump as some kind of freak show, some kind of aberration from everything that came before it. But on virtually any issue relevant to the Middle East that we're discussing today, one can make a more persuasive case that Trump is not a radical break with past American policy, but rather is a logical culmination of longstanding U.S. policy. So I'll just give you a few examples. During the first Trump administration, Trump recognized Israel's illegal claims of sovereignty over Jerusalem, and in violation of a UN Security Council resolution of 1980, Resolution 425 or 429, I can't remember exactly which, moved the U.S. Embassy to Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Was this an invention by Trump and his crown prince, Prince Jared of Kushner? No, because you go back and you look at congressional legislation from the 1990s, the U.S. Congress, with overwhelming bipartisan support, had adopted one resolution after the other requiring the United States government to recognize Israel's exclusive claims of sovereignty over Jerusalem in direct violation of international law, and to relocate the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, also in direct violation of international law. And Trump's predecessors had in fact begun preparations to this effect. The only thing Trump did is that these acts of legislation I'm talking about gave the occupant of the White House the right to sign 6 monthly waivers to postpone the implementation of that legislation. And all Trump did, Trump didn't introduce new legislation to move the embassy or recognize Israel's illegal claims of sovereignty. All Trump did is no longer sign waivers, meaning laws that had been passed long before he came into office with overwhelming bipartisan support became implementable. You look at Trump's position on UNRWA. There's been a witch hunt against UNRWA within the U.S. Congress for decades before Trump started his own witch hunt against the agency. And Trump's shutting down of the PLO mission to Washington and expulsion of its diplomats. The U.S. Congress, again with overwhelming bipartisan support, in fact defined the PLO as a terrorist organization in 1987 and made it illegal for the PLO to operate in the United States. So all Trump did is he stopped signing waivers allowing the PLO to maintain a mission in the United States. So here again, this idea that somehow, the rule of law, international legal institutions were somehow in pristine form until Trump came along. Look at what Biden did during his administration. It's true that he lifted the sanctions that the first Trump administration had placed on the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and a few other of its officials. But apart from that, take, for example, United Nations Security Council resolutions. There is a ruling from the International Court of Justice that there is no hierarchy among Security Council resolutions. In other words, all of them are equally binding on every member state of the United Nations. Now, when the Security Council resolution finally, due to the absence of a U.S. veto, was able to pass a resolution calling for a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip in 2024, I can't remember exactly when or which resolution it was, you had its Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, immediately come out and say it was not binding, basically making the argument that some Security Council resolutions, those that the U.S. likes, are binding, and others, those that the U.S. is indifferent to, are not binding. Well, if that's not seeking to undermine the operation of international institutions and international law, I don't know what is. You look at the constant attacks by the Biden administration, by Blinken and others against the International Court of Justice after it agreed to hear South Africa's genocide case against South Africa, denouncing it as meritless. It's the judges of the ICJ, not the U.S. State Department, that decides what is merited and what is meritless. But, Biden, Blinken, because he attended law school, had appointed himself a global authority on the interpretation of the Genocide Convention. So what Trump is doing is hardly something new. It's hardly an aberration. We have extensive evidence of the U.S. intensively lobbying member states, the ICC, the ICJ, in order not to perform their duties, in order not to fulfill their obligations under international law. Trump, at best, is just taking it to a higher level. And just as a general comment, I mean, what you have now, what you had, is on the one hand the international system as we've known it since 1945, where you have international institutions, international law that is supposed to apply to all states. And then you have what's called the rules-based international order, which is basically, for you, international law needs to be scrupulously adhered to, and you will be subject to any punishment that we consider appropriate if you deviate in any way from your official responsibilities and obligations. But since we make the rules, we and our friends can simply ignore them and act as we please. So Trump is basically reinforcing the rules-based international order by also beginning to say that these rules not only don't apply to us, but under certain circumstances, they don't apply to our adversaries either. So that, for example, Russia is getting something of a free pass in Ukraine now. So it's basically saying this deeply bankrupt rules-based international order is now more explicitly being transformed into the law of the jungle.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you mentioned the ICJ and the ICC not applying for the affiliates of the United States. Norman Finkelstein is currently working on a book that exposes the corruption and bribery that took place behind the scenes, before the recent rulings from the ICC and ICJ, the bribery with Bensouda and all these stories. So I really encourage everyone to watch that interview that you did, Mouin, with Norman Finkelstein on this, and watch that space. The book, I think, will be released in July this year at some point.
Yes.
We're hearing many countries recognizing the Palestinian state at the UN. We're also hearing this slogan that has permeated the entire world, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which has also been dismissed as anti-Semitic in many Western countries, and it's wrongly perceived as, eradicating or called for eradicating the state of Israel. So I can't help but wondering, what does the international recognition of a Palestinian state actually mean under the current circumstances? Does it mean going back to Oslo? And, is this recognition going to make any future impact on the ground in achieving justice and equality? Some say that practically it's impossible to pursue that end as long as Zionism persists.
Well, recognition is symbolic, and you can make an argument that it's politically meaningful. But in practical terms, recognition is meaningless when nothing is done to transform that recognition into a reality. So recognizing a Palestinian state while continuing to look the other way, while Israel relentlessly expands its settlements in the occupied territories, while it perpetrates genocide against the population of the Gaza Strip, while it engages now in ethnic cleansing in the northern West Bank, while continuing to supply Israel with arms. It's not very credible. I mean, two states has become nothing more than a meaningless slogan. It is those who most loudly proclaim their support for a two-state settlement who are most guilty for removing it from the agenda, because it is they, and primarily they, who have provided Israel with the means to transform this vision of two states into genocidal apartheid entity from the river to the sea. And now you have, like you said, all this whining about the slogan "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" is somehow anti-Semitic. This is from the same people who would have difficulty identifying a single living organism or inanimate object that is not anti-Semitic. But somehow, official Israeli maps that identify the entirety of mandatory Palestine from the river to the sea as Israel, somehow Israeli officials in positions of responsibility constantly proclaiming their exclusive hegemony, their exclusive claim, their exclusive ownership of the territory from the river to the sea. That's all perfectly acceptable. We never complain about that. We never whine about that. We never shut anyone up about that. But God forbid a Palestinian asks for their freedom, all hell breaks loose.
Well said. Yes, it's something that we're struggling with here. Our government usually give us these perfunctory statements.
It's obscene. It's really obscene. And I think it exposes the real agenda that these people have, which is to support Israeli hegemony, to support Israel's ability to permanently control the land and dispossess the Palestinian people without having to say so explicitly. So instead of coming out openly in support of Israel, we go after Israel's victims and say that they're somehow, guilty of all this diabolical, horrible business by uttering a slogan in favor of their own freedom.
And they failed to address the core issue of the entire, if you want to call it, conflict. It is the settler colonial nature of this ideology. That is, it's by nature ever expanding, and it's never going to stop at two-state solution, one Zionist state and one Palestinian state.
Well, I do think Israel has demonstrated persistently, repeatedly, at every opportunity, that it has an insatiable lust for Palestinian land, that it is almost incapable to stop, as you said. It's almost like it couldn't stop even if it wanted to. And the only way that Israeli territorial expansionism and dispossession of the Palestinians are going to stop is if outside forces, whether Palestinians, Arab states, or Israel's sponsors and allies in the West, compel it to stop. You could make an argument that in the 80s and the 90s, that Israeli public opinion was still in a position that, had it properly mobilized, that it could have perhaps compelled its government to accept peaceful coexistence with the Palestinian people. That's speculation. That's my personal opinion. I could be wrong, but what I am certain about is that is no. We've gone way past that point. You look at Israeli public opinion in recent years, and particularly since October 2023. I mean, it has become, for all intents and purposes, an openly genocidal society that bays for Palestinian blood around the clock. I mean, you listen to, their most prominent media commentators, their politicians, they seem to be on a national mission to erase any distinction between a Palestinian civilian and combatant. The main criticism of the most extreme right-wing government in Israeli history is that it's not violent enough towards the Palestinians, and that it should be doing much more to get rid of them. So Israeli society, I think, and I'm not talking about every Israeli, I'm talking about Israeli society in general. Of course, there are very honorable exceptions, but Israeli society is no longer capable, even if it wanted to, of compelling its leadership to accept peaceful coexistence with the Palestinians. And the dilemma here is that the Palestinians and the Arab states, they can perhaps make things difficult for Israel, but they're incapable of imposing that on Israel as well. And in terms of Israel's Western sponsors and allies, well, the problem there is not that they don't want to or that they can't, but you have a combination of active support of Israel and passive acquiescence in what it is doing.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, by and large, the Israeli society is actually, and that's what Professor Haim Rashid Zabner mentioned, it's actually what happened in Gaza is a democratic genocide. It's by the consensus of more than 96% of the Israeli society. So it's unfortunate to see this kind of agreement, coming out of this decades-long indoctrination process of the Jewish minds in general.
And here I would like to point to an important distinction between, for example, Israel and South Africa. South Africa was a much larger country, had many more resources, and for decades, despite being an international pariah during the apartheid years of its white minority regime, was able to sustain itself. Israel is an entirely different kettle of fish. Israel is entirely dependent on the goodwill of its Western sponsors and allies. That is also why Israel is so extraordinarily sensitive to public perceptions of itself and of what it does. And what this means is that changing Israeli policy would be is a much, much, much simpler affair than, for example, forcing an end to apartheid in South Africa. Of course, the other key difference with South Africa is it had a population that was 90% African, whereas in Israel, Palestine now it's only about 50%. But focusing on the role of external actors, they have much more influence over Israel than they ever did over South Africa. South Africa was essentially liberated by its own people. Of course, its supporters abroad and ultimately foreign powers did play a role, but the overwhelming majority of the heavy lifting was done by the people of South Africa. In the case of Israel, you can actually easily envision a situation where its sponsors and allies withhold their support and it's game over for the occupation.
It's so important to draw the distinction between the South African struggle against apartheid and our struggle against apartheid Israel. That's probably a whole nother episode on its own. How do you see the dynamics in the Palestinian factions playing out as unity is crucial for advancement of rights of the people?
Well, unfortunately, there is no unity among Palestinian people, and that's actually one of the main challenges that are being faced. It both helps explain the context for the crisis of the past 2 years. It helps explain its eruption, and it helps explain the challenges Palestinians are currently facing. The Palestinian body politic has essentially been ripped by a schism since 2006, 2007. And I think the only way out of this is for the Palestinians to unify within the context of their national representative, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which would involve a preparedness by the PLO leadership to incorporate Hamas and Islamic Jihad into the PLO, and then through a process of consultation, debate, and discussion to agree on a national strategy, and then to agree on mechanisms on how to mobilize in support of that national strategy, most importantly, how to mobilize their greatest resource, which is the Palestinian people, wherever they may be. I have my criticisms of both the Palestinian Authority, of Fatah, of Hamas, and for that matter, pretty much of everyone else. But I think the one insurmountable obstacle to reaching a resolution of this crisis is the current Palestinian leader, Mahmoud Abbas, him personally, more than the PA or Fatah or anyone else. And I think until he drops dead or is removed from the scene or retires or whatever, I think serious discussion of a resolution of this issue only becomes possible once he is no longer there to block it.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, all these talks of unities over the past, I don't know, 20 years, ever since Hamas took power, actually, they were all sabotaged and didn't go ahead either because of Mahmoud Abbas or because of Israel and Netanyahu refusing to negotiate with any kind of united.
Well, I would leave Israel out of this for a second because sure, Israel has a strategic has Palestinian fragmentation and division as a strategic objective. That's certainly true, but that should in no way prevent the Palestinians from achieving unity, and they're perfectly capable of doing this despite Israeli opposition and obstruction. The problem has been that on multiple occasions during the past 2 decades, we have actually had serious negotiations between the two main rival factions, Fatah and Hamas. We've had agreements reached between them that have then also been endorsed by other important players in the Palestinian political arena. And we've actually had the beginnings of implementation in some cases. And while Abbas has not been the sole obstacle, he has been the primary obstacle. And we've had multiple occasions where he has been the one to ensure that agreements reached even by his own Fatah movement, which he heads, that the movement has accepted, are not implemented.
Absolutely. I do want to go into another question. 12 years ago, you wrote an essay rejecting the one-state solution in favor of two-state solutions. So that was 12 years ago, thousands of events, political events ago. So what's your current position, and what do you think is a viable solution right now?
Well, I've never rejected a one-state solution. That's inaccurate. In fact, in that article, this was an article I wrote in Jadaliyya, I make explicitly clear that a democratic state in which Palestinians and Israeli Jews live as equals is the preferred solution. The question I raised is that if we reject a two-state settlement, and I make a distinction between a two-state settlement and a one-state solution. If we reject a two-state settlement because we have prioritized a one-state solution, are we serving Palestinian interests? And I make the argument about not only why, in my view, a two-state settlement was still achievable, and I won't bore you with the details now, but also following on things that had been said at the time by, for example, Edward Said about how an end to occupation and a two-state settlement has a potential for a genuinely transformative effect in Israeli-Palestinian relations that could then make the objective of a one-state solution that much closer and make it possible to achieve it through peaceful means. Where Palestinians would have the advantage. That was my view then. To a certain extent, I mean, as a theoretical matter, I think much of that is still valid. But I've also come to the conclusion that there can be no peace with this genocidal apartheid state. We've discussed its insatiable lust for Palestinian land. We're now also confronting its insatiable lust for Palestinian blood and its insatiable lust for regional hegemony. I simply don't see circumstances in which this state can ever bring itself to accept peaceful coexistence with the Palestinian people. And in addition to that, there's another, I think, vitally important issue, which is that generally speaking, a regime that is guilty of genocide, ultimately, it needs to be removed. That happened in Germany, 1940s. happened in Cambodia in the 1970s, and one can, of course, think of different examples in the former Yugoslavia. So I see no reason why this genocidal apartheid state should somehow have impunity and be able to escape accountability for its actions when its peers in the 20th century and in more recent history have had to confront the consequences of their actions and be held accountable for them. I do not believe that there can or should be coexistence with a genocidal apartheid state.
How far are we from this end goal, do you think, after this genocide and after this global mobilization, seeking to dismantle apartheid and this genocidal state?
That's, of course, a purely speculative question. I suspect we are some way off from that. Yes, we are seeing, I think, very significant and important changes, certainly at the level of, for example, Western public opinion. But, these changes take time to work themselves through the political system and be changed into policy, the government policy. That's going to take years, and I think we need to be patient and recognize, that we're in this for the long haul, and not lose hope and throw up our our hands in despair if we don't see changes at the pace at which we would like to see them. It's important to persevere and not think that instant gratification is going to be a realistic prospect. Then you have the international legal order. Now, one can make all kinds of legitimate criticisms of international law, international institutions, and so on. But I think the International Court of Justice, by accepting that South Africa had plausibly accused Israel of genocide, which it did in January of last year, was massively significant. It basically ripped the mask off Israel as the victim state. Israel, which had for decades used the Holocaust as a shield to defend itself from criticism of its own conduct to the Palestinians. Well, you can't really do that very effectively when you are yourself accused of genocide and already considered guilty of perpetrating genocide by a growing consensus of genocide specialists, Holocaust scholars, human rights organizations, and all the rest of it. And then on top of that, to have your head of government and minister of defense indicted as war criminals by the International Criminal Court, well, it is going to take a long time to achieve justice, but it's going to take a little less time because of these developments in the international legal arena.
It's a marathon, and we shouldn't really lose hope into the future. Talking about the international legal system, is there any way the General Assembly could override the Security Council and abolish the veto concept? I mean, there is no,
one word answer, no.
Because there's currently an idea of, removing Israel from the
That's different. So that's different. The General Assembly does not have the authority to change the procedures of the Security Council. So the General Assembly cannot tomorrow pass a resolution saying, for example, the United States or Russia are expelled from the Security Council, or Security Council members no longer have a veto. Nor can they expel a member state from the United Nations. And South Africa is the best example of that. South Africa was not expelled. The white minority regime of South Africa was not expelled from the United Nations because that would require, if I'm not mistaken, the consent of the Security Council resolution, and the United States did not support that. What the General Assembly can do is expel a member state from the General Assembly. It can expel a state from its own ranks. And that is a massively symbolic and politically important step that did happen to South Africa in 1974. and it's certainly a possible measure that can be taken against Israel. I would also urge people to look more closely at the case of Rhodesia, what is now Zimbabwe, the former Rhodesia, because in the case of Rhodesia, the Security Council also got involved because Rhodesia in 1965 adopted what was known as a unilateral declaration of independence, which upset the British, and so the Security Council acted against Rhodesia in ways that it never did against South Africa. And if you look, for example, at the measures the Security Council took against the white minority regime in Rhodesia, it had a travel ban, had all kinds of punitive sanctions at the time. And if I'm not mistaken, but I could be because I'm not entirely sure on this point, Rhodesia actually was expelled from the United Nations.
That's very interesting. I'm going to go to this question about unity again. Do you think the Chinese efforts will, help into, consolidating the Palestinian unity, the different parties?
Well, they certainly don't hurt, but what I think needs to be understood about efforts to achieve Palestinian unity is that outside powers, in this case, the Russians and the Chinese, they host meetings and they broker negotiations, and even agreements are sometimes reached under auspices. But this is a file that is very jealously guarded by Egypt. And so at the end of the day, neither Hamas nor Fatah are going to reach and conclude and implement a significant agreement that is not reached under Egyptian auspices. Because if they do, Cairo will get mightily upset with them for having deprived it of its starring role in this dossier. So what you've had recently, for example, is that the Palestinian factions, as they're called, did travel to Beijing and did conclude an agreement there, and it kind of remained ink on paper until more recently, Fatah and Hamas reached an agreement in Cairo about the form and shape of a post-war administration, if I can use that term, in the Gaza Strip. So that was kind of an Egyptian agreement, if you will, or at least one concluded under Egyptian auspices.
Do you think Israel will ever release Marwan al-Barghouti? It was supposed to be released with Ahmed Saadat and other, really huge figures in the Palestinian community in the second phase.
Well, there are several complications with that. As you know, Hamas is particularly keen to bring about the release of not only its own militants and leaders who are in Israeli prisons, but also of those of other factions like Ahmed Saadat of the Popular Front and Marwan Barghouti of Fatah, because that way it can demonstrate to its constituents that it's acting in the national and not only in the factional interest. And Marwan Barghouti is in this case a particularly important individual for them, not only for the reason I just enumerated, but also because he has been an advocate of consensual politics between Fatah and Hamas, and is seen as a credible successor to Mahmoud Abbas. And obviously, if he was able to get out because of Hamas's efforts and then became president, he would presumably be well disposed towards some form of power sharing with Hamas and supporting their incorporation into the PLO and so on. Barghouti was very high on Hamas's agenda in 2011 during what was known as the Shalit prisoner exchange. But Israel had then passed legislation requiring a majority of its parliament for the release of certain individuals and so on. And Hamas tried very hard to ensure his inclusion in that exchange of prisoners, but in the end was persuaded that if it continued to insist on his release, it would take many more years of negotiations before that could be achieved. And ultimately, they abandoned him and concluded a prisoner exchange agreement with Israel. I think this time it's fundamentally different. I think this time it would be a very serious defeat for Hamas if this entire process continues and is concluded, and Marwan Barghouti remains in Israel's prison system. I'm not saying that means he's going to get out. I just think that he is an absolute priority for Hamas for the reasons I stated. But in addition to Israel wanting to keep him in prison, we also need to understand that there are powerful Palestinian forces that want to keep him in Israel's prisons, and particularly Mahmoud Abbas. I mean, I've in the past, Fadwa Barghouti, Marwan Barghouti's wife, has openly accused Abbas and his former minion and now rival, Mohammed Dahlan, of lobbying Israel and the United States to keep Marwan Barghouti in prison because Abbas sees him as a threat to his own position.
Abbas's involvement is not just about preventing unity. It's and that's the nature of him being a subcontractor of the occupation and colonization in general. And that's what Oslo was about in the first place. So my last question to you, Mouin, not Marwan. Hopefully we'll be able to interview Marwan when he's out one day.
Yes, I hope so.
Can the global pro-Palestine, anti-genocide movement succeed to bring about justice and equality in Palestine, at this time of oligarchs-funded mass high-tech silencing campaigns? We saw Musk, taking the lead of the Trump administration. And perhaps more importantly, I really want to ask as well, how does the future of the resistance in Palestine look like, in this kind of political environment?
Well, I don't think that the global solidarity movement, that the global movement for justice in Palestine should judge itself by its ability to directly change reality on the ground in Palestine. I think that's too ambitious, and that would be being too hard on themselves. There's very few examples in history where a struggle is won or lost on the basis of the activities or lack thereof of solidarity activists abroad. What I think the primary ambition of this movement should be, and it's an ambition that I think is entirely achievable, but again, is one that requires patience and persistence, is to change the policies of their own governments on issues both large and small, on issues from trade with Israel and the supply of military supplies and intelligence to Israel, to formal acts of recognition and all the rest of it. I think charity begins at home, and I think that these movements should focus on their home countries and the policies of their own governments towards what is happening in the Middle East, which I think is their primary duty and responsibility. And I think can also be energizing in the sense that that is an arena where they will be able to see results. That is also, I think, an arena where it is more easy to mobilize additional membership and support. And of course, ultimately, it will contribute to change in the Middle East, but I don't think they should have the illusion that reality in the Middle East will be the outcome of, what they do in Australia or Denmark or Argentina.
And just my second part of the question, why I decided to ask this question, the future of the Palestinian resistance in Gaza and in Palestine. Given the recent tacit negotiations between Hamas and Trump, are we seeing more of a diplomatic type of resistance in Palestine at the moment?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer. We started this discussion by pointing out how fluid and unpredictable the situation is, and I'm not really going to venture a guess on whether Palestinians are now transitioning to a political struggle, a combination of political and armed militancy, whether it will be primarily within Palestine, whether the Palestinian citizens of Israel are going to get involved, what is going to be the role of the surrounding countries. and movements and individuals that support them in those countries. I think it's very difficult to provide an intelligent answer on that. But I think one thing we have learned during the last year and a half is that no matter what Israel does, no matter how much its supporters and apologists and flunkies abroad vilify the Palestinian people and the very concept of Palestine, and demonize, delegitimize, and denounce and criminalize and all the rest of it, the Palestinian people will never give up. They will never surrender, and they will keep struggling for their rights until those rights are achieved. And for over a century, Israel and its supporters, including what was once the greatest power in the world, the Great Britain, and what is now the greatest power in human history, the United States, have thrown everything they have at this people, and they have not surrendered, and they will not surrender.
That's a great note to end on. I do want to thank you very much, Mouin.
I just wanted to thank you for hosting me, and I've really enjoyed this discussion.
Likewise, and hopefully we'll do more of those discussions, because I personally have so many other questions, around Iran, around Syria, around, the recent proposal by Arab leadership, and so on and so forth. So it would be good to talk more, and I've been watching you very closely in your interviews. So thank you for all the work.
Thank you.
You do.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Palestinian Show, Red Inverted Triangle. If you'd like to learn more about Palestine, or if you'd like to get involved in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, please follow Palestine Justice Movement Sydney on Instagram or Facebook. And keep tuning in to Red Inverted Triangle. My name is Ahmed. I will see you next time.